In this video, I do an entire demonstration on how to paint chrome. I paint this image of a milk frother in a coffee mug. Painting chrome has nothing to do with using silver paint. You need to be able to mix the colors accurately, and I show you how I mix colors in this video. I also show you my technique for creating a more accurate drawing, because you really need to do that in order to get these abstract shapes to look right. So let's get started. If you want to paint chrome, you need a good reference photograph. Here's the photograph I'm using, and it took a while to get to this setup. I can show you some of the previous setups and how you can make an object look more chrome. You can download the reference photograph by signing up for my free email newsletter. There's a link to it in the description below. So here's a couple of early shots where I was setting this up. And you can tell that this is reflective, but it's not as shiny as the finished version that I have. If you're a still life painter, it does help to improve your photography skills, and that includes setting up lighting. So what makes something look like chrome or that it's really shiny? Well, there's reflections, there's hard edges, and there's soft edges. There's also areas where there's gradients. Now this is an early setup, and there's some of that in there. You can see on the left side there's a highlight, but as I progress, I add more things to it. In this photograph, I added a piece of foam board over here, and that created this white stripe here, which makes it look even more shiny. And then I added some strawberries and I moved that foam board over a little bit, but I start to play with it even more, where I add a light to one side of the foam board so it creates like a gradient within that stripe. That makes it look even more shiny. And then I start playing around with the angle of the camera, and I also play around with the different colors in the background. The final image, I did switch the milk frother over to the left-hand side, but you can see that that lighting made this look interesting too. But you can also see that there's a reflection here of the strawberries, and it's totally distorted. That's one of the challenges of painting chrome, is that it's like painting a mirror that's curved around a surface. So it's like painting a funhouse mirror. This strawberry is reflected on this side, and these strawberries on the right are reflected over on the right-hand side. So in my previous video about how I broke my painting rules, I used AI to generate a still life image. And I thought I would show the difference between a still life that I set up and one that ChatGPT created. So I used a prompt that described my still life idea, which is a milk frother with a turquoise coffee mug and some strawberries. And this is the image that it created. At first glance, it's not too bad. It's in like a Renaissance style, so that's why the colors are a little bit more muted. But if you look at these reflections, they don't look right. How is it possible that strawberries off to the side would be in the center of this milk frother? It doesn't make any sense. If you look at this image, a strawberry off to the side creates reflections that are on the side, and they're highly distorted. This doesn't make much sense because the strawberries would have to be in the front here. These errors like this come from the fact that AI doesn't create wireframes or use physics to determine where highlights and shadows and reflections should be. So that's why I'm still using my own still life materials, because it just seems to look more natural. To make things simpler for yourself, when you photograph silver, it makes sense to clean up your area so all your tools and things don't end up being reflected in the cup like this. So I kept it simple, and I kept the foam board off to the side to reflect some light back over here. And this is the reflection of the light itself. I'm going to tone this panel first. It just makes it easier to judge the colors. And the quickest way to do that is to use like fluid acrylics or soft body acrylics. Just put a dab on there. Then you can spray it with a little bit of water and wipe it down with a cotton pad. You can give it one more spritz if it starts to dry out on you. And then just take a clean pad and just wipe it down. Adding a tone to the panel makes it way easier to judge your colors. And that's because white can be really harsh and throw things off. Getting your colors right is a big part of making chrome look realistic. I'll show you how I mix mine later in the video, but if color mixing is something you want to get better at, I've got a playlist here on YouTube and a color mixing course that covers the basics. You'll find both linked in the description below. That didn't take long at all, and now I have a nice warm color to work on top of. And it's pretty much already dry because I wiped it down. This is kind of hard to see with all the glare, but I have this overlay with a grid drawn on here. I'll draw the exact same grid on my panel, that way I can focus on drawing what's in each individual square. And it also gives me reference points, so I can tell that this milk frother is lined up with this pink line here. I really only need the squares, but the cross helps find the center of the panel, and it makes it easy to divide these up. All right, so I don't really need these diagonals for the grid, but it makes it super easy to measure the center of this. So if you draw an X, and this is the Faber-Castell watercolor pencil, you can easily erase this by going over it with a wet rag. So now I could just use a right triangle to draw the vertical center, and do the same for the vertical. And I'll just extend this. And in order to get the center lines for the smaller squares, you do the same thing. You just find the diagonal. And where they intersect, that's the center. So there we have it. The grid's all drawn out, and I didn't measure anything. I like to use acrylic markers to sketch out my drawing. And the thing is, they use the same permanent pigments that they use in a professional line of paints. So these acrylic paints won't bleed through my final painting, and they're waterproof when they're done. That way I can erase my grid if I want to, when I'm done with the drawing. So I have a whole video about this, but I like to draw with like a light color first, and when I'm trying to finalize the lines, I use a darker color. I don't bother erasing, I just keep drawing. So when the drawing becomes too fuzzy, I switch over to the darker color, rather than erasing lines. It seems to be faster that way. I'll begin the drawing with the milk frother, and you'll notice that it's pretty much lined up with this line here, so I'll use that as a guide. The bottom of it is close to the intersection here. That's another indication that I can follow. And it's almost close to the center. So these are the reference points that I use in order to get the drawing more correct. You can also use transfer paper to trace the photograph onto your panel or your canvas. And I did that in my video about breaking my own rules for painting. There's a link to it in the related video section in the description below. You can use a ruler just to put in the lines of the countertop. Another nice alignment is the handle on this mug lines up perfectly with this line here. I've got most of this filled in. I used the darker brown color to reinforce some of these lines and to make corrections. There's only a few things left that I'd like to detail, and that would be some of these reflections here. That's one of the major points about painting chrome, is that you need a good foundation to paint on top of. And the reason why chrome is difficult is because there's all these little weird shapes in here. I mean, this is like a funhouse mirror. That's a strawberry. That little bit of turquoise is the coffee mug. I mean, what shape is that? So I feel like you need to do whatever you need to do to get an accurate drawing of those shapes. I'm using a grid, but you could also just transfer the drawing like I mentioned before. And another option would be to project it and trace it. And I have a video in the description below where I show how I set up a slide projector and I enlarged the drawing onto a much larger canvas. So I'm looking at the shapes here, and I have this finer Posca marker. It's got a fine tip on there. And I could just spend a little bit of time, maybe like 5-10 minutes, and just sort of refine some of these shapes so I know what I'm doing when I'm painting. I could technically do this with the paint, but I feel like it's easier if you draw some of it. That way you're not restating things with the paint, you're doing that with the marker. So I'll spend a little bit of time, get this right, and I'll start painting. So I think this is good enough to get started. I put in some of those reflections in here, and I reinforced some of the other lines. Since these grid lines are watercolor pencil, I could just erase them with a wet rag. You can leave them in there if you want, but they will lift when you paint over them a little bit. Or you could just use regular pencil and leave it in there. The marker stays put because it's water resistant. Here's an overhead shot of my setup. This is like a drafting table easel that I have set up on my table so that it's at a slant. It's good that it's on a slant because you don't want to have your head tilted down the whole time you're painting because it'll make your neck sore. I covered that in more detail in my health and safety video. There's a link to it in the description below. But I also have my glass palette taped down to the drafting table, and there's like a little lip here at the bottom that keeps it from sliding down. In my previous video about breaking my own painting rules, I used this plastic palette, and I had it on the same surface as my painting. I found that it was easier to use because the colors were very close to the painting, whereas normally I have an easel and then the flat table. It also seems to help to take it out of the Masterson box because you don't have a lip going around the outside edge. I'm just being careful here with the duct tape so that it doesn't slide off of here. Even though there's a ledge here, I just thought I would secure it. When I'm done for the day, I'll just take this off and put it into the box to keep it wet overnight. This is kind of nice in that it's larger and there's no edges on it, and I should be able to get more colors on here than I did on this small one. I've been using more colors ever since I made that video about breaking my own painting rules. So instead of using the usual like 5 or 6 colors, I'll probably use more like 10 to 12 colors. So I'll just squeeze these out and then we'll get started. This is cadmium yellow primrose. I'm getting to the end of my cadmium orange, so I'm just squeezing it out here with my tube wringer. I made a video about this too, where buying one of these definitely pays for itself because artist paints are expensive. And they also work on things like toothpaste and other things that come in tubes. This is cadmium red light. This is pyrrole red. You'll notice that the pyrrole red is more red than the cadmium red light, which seems to be a little bit more orange. This is quinacridone magenta. Ultramarine blue. I'm at the end of this tube, but I do have a smaller tube that I could probably use. Phthalo blue green shade. I'm at the end of this tube. It seems like I'm using up all my paints today. Burnt sienna. Burnt umber. Titanium white. And I do like this Titan Buff, which is an off-white color. It comes in handy when you need a lighter color that's not so stark. I would normally mix it, but this is a nice shortcut. For this painting, I'm going to continue the process of working on one area until it's complete and then moving on. That's another approach that I'm implementing from my previous video about breaking my own rules. It seems to help to do the most difficult thing first, so I'll start on this reflection here and then expand outwards. I'll start with the Titan Buff, a little bit of the red and some ultramarine, and that would go in this section right here. I forgot to add my palette gray, which is all my leftover colors from previous paintings. When you mix it together, it makes like a grayish color, depending on what you started with. I have an entire video about how I store leftover paint like this. I find that they work better than the empty metal tubes because you can reuse them. So I think I'll use some of this gray to make it a little bit darker. I'm starting with this gradient and then I'll work into these weird shapes. It's pretty bright on the left-hand side and it gets darker right here. So I mixed up a darker gray and I'll just put that in there real quick. Another thing to keep in mind is if you got the color on the brush, you might as well fill in the other areas that have that color. I'm starting with this section because it's the most difficult, and when you start a painting, that's when you have the most amount of energy and enthusiasm, so it makes sense to try and tackle the hardest parts first. So I'm just mixing the light color with the darker color, and I just added in between these two colors, and it sort of creates like a little blend by itself. So as I move towards the left, I'll just add more of the lighter color, add it in here, and that sort of creates a blend without trying too hard. For the pure section, I'll use mostly titanium white, and maybe I'll add a little bit of the Titan Buff in there to make it a little bit duller. And maybe I could use a little bit of the magenta, see how that looks. And some of that bright color is here too. I'm not going to blend it right away. Sometimes it helps to let it sit. If you try to blend it right away, sometimes the paint is a little bit too soupy and it just sort of slides around on the panel. But if you let it tack up a little bit, it seems like it's easier to blend. One of the things that makes chrome look shiny is a lot of the contrast between the bright highlight sections and the shadow areas. On the reference photo, there's a very dark stripe right here. So I think I'll put that in there just so I know if I'm going light enough with these highlight colors, and it should also help create the illusion that it's shiny. So for that, I'll just start with carbon black, and I think I'll add some ultramarine blue to it, maybe a touch of this Titan Buff. And it has more color in there, so I'll add some magenta. I could just use some of this gray just to use it up. This is tricky because this is one of the reasons why I recommend mixing your own black. Black is a good shortcut, but I think when you're learning, it definitely helps to like mix your own blacks because there are subtle color variations in it, and it makes it look more real if you get that right. All right, so I'll probably just put that in there now. I come back and fix it. This footage is from the section in my color mixing course where I show how to mix black from primary colors, and then I mix gray from it. I then show how to make the subtle adjustments to make it more neutral. I also show examples from my color matching videos that look like they're gray, but when you compare them side by side, you can see they have color to them. Some grays might have more blue or red in them, for instance. If you want to dive deeper into mixing neutrals and seeing colors more accurately, there's a link to my course in the description below. So this is pretty quick. There's not much variation in here. There is a section on the left that's a little bit lighter, but I could probably add that later. There's a nice curve at the bottom here. So you don't really need to know what these shapes are. You just have to get them in there accurately. But if you think about it, if you look at the reference photo, this curve shape right here is the reflection of the napkin that's underneath it, or the cloth, whatever this is. So that's what sort of helps make it look shiny and like it's curved, is that there's all these distortions in it. So your job is just to paint these accurately as if you're recording it like a camera. You really don't need to know the physics of it or anything else. I think I'll put in this section right here, which is this darker color, and it has a little bit more beige in it. So I can take some of this Titan Buff and maybe a little bit of the ultramarine and some burnt sienna. Touch of cad yellow because it's a bit warmer. People comment that you don't really need to get the colors that accurate, but it just helps to create the illusion of chrome when you get the colors right. I put that shape in there, and now I'll move on to these shapes over here. So when you paint chrome like this, a lot of times you look at these shapes and it's like, what is this? Chrome always has weird reflections like this because of all the distortions. It can be difficult to paint because your mind really can't figure out what this is. So you really have to think about these as abstract shapes. Even though I know that that's like the strawberry because it's red, it's not a strawberry shape. And that's where it helps to sort of like establish shapes around it. And it's sort of like a puzzle. These pieces interlock in there and you just sort of paint one at a time. That's why the grid helps, is that it sort of helps you place these shapes in the right position. I'll start with this darker shape. It's just like this big ellipse with like a rounded top. Once you get like a couple shapes established, it sort of helps you figure out where the other shapes should land. I think I'll do the strawberry shapes next. And this is the cad red light. I'll probably add a little bit of the parallel red to it. Because like I said before, the CAD red light's a little bit orangey. I do think it could go a little bit darker in sections, so ultramarine blue will make it darker. I can see a little bit of the red comes up here. So I'm going to paint the turquoise color from the coffee mug that's being reflected. And I forgot to add phthalo green to my palette. So I'll add a little bit at the corner here. It definitely helps with mixing turquoise colors, and I have a whole video about mixing green. And within that video, I demonstrate how to mix turquoise. So it's phthalo green blue shade. So that's phthalo green, a little bit of white, maybe a touch of the phthalo blue. And that's not too bad, maybe a little more white. Just a touch of this red to make it duller. I think that's pretty good to start with. I kind of get a sense that maybe that's the handle right here, but I'm not really quite sure. There's a highlight in there, I could put that in there later. So this is what I'm talking about. This looks kind of weird, like it's just a patchwork of colors. But as you paint more and more of this in there, it starts to make more sense, especially when you get the red color in there. So your mind looks at it and it's like, oh yeah, that's the reflection of the strawberry. But right now it looks kind of strange. And also point out that the red oxide background does sort of help with judging these colors. If this was pure white, these colors would look even darker than what they are. So I'll continue on. I'll paint in this gray area underneath here, and there's some red being reflected into the shadow. And I'll continue on to this side and then fill in the middle part. So for the gray area, it's mostly the palette gray, and I added some of the CAD red light to it. And it's a pretty close approximation. With the drawing, you don't have to get too detailed. You just need like the basic shapes. And then when you paint, it's kind of like you can draw with the brush and fix things or add things if you need to. So I'm noticing this gray sort of gets lighter towards the left edge. So I need to add maybe a little bit of this color. I do think that that highlight needs to go more magenta too. Like this section right here, it's definitely warmer. I'll have to add that in there. So I added more magenta and yellow in here to make this warmer. Fine-tuning this color definitely helps make this look more real. And that's what I was referring to before, is taking the time to get these colors right is worth it. Adding this darker section on here, I can see that this has to go a little bit lighter right at this edge. And that's one of the things about chrome, is that there's a contrast between like a hard edge like this, and right next to it is this soft gradient. Here's another thing that you see a lot in chrome, is just very fine like bands of like dark areas and light areas. Brush probably isn't fine enough to get in there, but I'll try it. This darker section is not just all shadow. There's like a light streak that goes through here and another one here. So I'll put that in there, and I think that helps make this look more shiny. It shows up more on the actual photo. This print's a little bit dark. So there's like that zigzag shape. I think I need to add a little water to my paint. The water will just make it flow a little bit better. This might look a little wavy in the beginning, but I can always come back and clean it up. If I don't add those little subtle details in there, that black looks like it's a piece of paper that's just like pasted on there. And there's like these little details at the top too, where it gets a little bit lighter on the rim, and I can add that in there. The dark section sort of goes across this area. I'm just blocking in this dark shape on the left side, and then I can go on to the highlight here. So this shadow over here is lighter than the middle, and it still has like lighter reflections going down the center of it. I'll show you what I mean. So there's like two very fine stripes that go down the side. It's these little details like that that starts to make it look shiny and reflective. So that's starting to come together. And on the very edge, there's a super thin white area. I'll have to fix that up, but I'm just trying to get the position right. Now that I have the darker areas in here, I'm going to establish the brightest highlights, which are in this reflection here. Now in the photograph, it's kind of blown out. It's probably just pure white, but I'm going to add a little bit of Titan buff just to make it a little bit less stark. I'll put that in and I'll see how that looks. There's some variation in here where it gets darker here, but then this bright highlight comes back down here. This section here is like a cooler gray, so I'll mix that up and put it in there. So that's mostly the palette gray and maybe a little bit of the ultramarine. Could add a touch of the magenta. It has to go lighter, so I'll add titanium white to it. It's about right. I'll start with this. This is like the shadow of the strawberry, and there's some red in there, so I added some of the CAD red light into it. One of the reflections is of the pattern in this cloth. I'm painting that shape in there first, so that way when I paint it into the reflection of the milk frother, it'll make more sense. A lot of the shapes in the bottom of the milk frother, that's from this cloth, so I'm putting in like the highlights. This is mostly blocked in now. I think I might come back later and put some more detail in there, especially along the bottom. I think I'll move on to doing the coffee mug next. It's similar to doing chrome in that it's reflective, but it's not like a mirror finish. I have phthalo green, and that's normally what I use to mix like turquoise colors. So phthalo green and white, and I think some phthalo blue might help. Definitely has more blue in it. Maybe I'll add some ultramarine in there, and it has to go lighter. So that right there is pretty close to the body of the mug. So for this area, that's not too bad, but I need a darker color for over here. So maybe more blue, a little bit of red, make it duller. Let's test it out. It's darker. I think maybe it has to go a little bit darker. I'm thinking maybe magenta, because that kind of creates like a purplish color. I think that's looking closer. So I have these two colors mixed up, and I'll just sort of like block them in. This should be faster because there's fewer reflections in here. If you'd like to see an entire demonstration of how to mix turquoise and different shades of green, I have an entire demo on that. There's a link to it in the related video section below. So I'm just mixing in more of that lighter color as I progress across the coffee mug, so it gets a little bit lighter. Just mixing in more white, so I get a very light shade, the coffee mug color. It still might have to go even a little bit lighter. And that's for the highlight right here. I put in some of the subtler details into the coffee mug, like the fine highlights on the handle and on the rim. But I think what would help both of these is if I were to paint in some of the background color. That way I can clean up the edges, but also it's nice to have some of the background color in there just to see how it works with these colors. This is titanium white with a combination of ultramarine blue and phthalo blue. I put the background colors in. They're not totally blended. I think I'll let it dry and consider it a base coat. I'm going to take a break and probably let this dry a little bit. I'll put a second coat on the background, and there's a bunch of stuff I want to fix in both the milk frother and the coffee mug. Then the rest of the painting should be pretty simple. It's mostly the countertop, and probably the hardest part will be this cloth and maybe the strawberries. If you'd like to watch another demo where the strawberries are the main focus, check out my video on why you should mix your own black and neutrals. There's a link in the description below. I went ahead and finished the rest of the painting. As I said, I like to start with the hardest parts first, so I focused mostly on the milk frother and the coffee mug. Once those were done, the rest of it came together more easily. I also painted over the background just to smooth it out a little bit better. It's not difficult, but it does take some patience and a bit of fine-tuning. From there, it's just a matter of adding details and making adjustments until everything feels balanced. To summarize the key points about how to paint the illusion of chrome, the most important thing is having a strong reference photo, and that starts with an understanding of how to light your subject. And a good composition helps too. Remember that chrome isn't about using silver paint. It's about painting the reflections that you actually see. That's where a solid drawing really helps. The reflections are just abstract shapes, and if they're in the wrong place, the whole illusion starts to fall apart. You can use a grid or transfer paper to help with the accuracy. Whatever gives you the best chance of placing those shapes with confidence. Up next, you can watch my other videos where I paint chrome. There's the video about how to blend student acrylics like oils. And I also have videos on how to paint transparent glass, which is pretty similar because it's reflections. If you found this video useful, please consider subscribing, and thanks for watching.